For between 40 and 50 years now, I've been claiming with increasing assertiveness that what lies at the heart of the current Caribbean challenge is an epistemic crisis of immense proportions. I'm arguing that we, Caribbean persons, are, for whatever reason, caught in a historic knowledge trap, an epistemic conundrum that prohibits us from delimiting our own condition within definite coordinates of culture and institution, meaning our own place. We're therefore largely blind to reality. My counter-strategy has been to locate myself in our landscape and to play for change. Lloyd Best, 2003. Lloyd Best had a way of looking at the world. He had a way of looking at the Caribbean. He had a way of looking at Trinidad and Tobago. Lloyd Best possessed vision. Professor Lloyd Best, a Caribbean intellectual. Lloyd Algernon Best was first and foremost a Trinidadian intellectual. Beyond that, he was an economist of international repute, a founder of the New World Group and the Tapia House Group of Independent Thinkers, the political leader of the evolved Tapia House movement, a publisher of intellectual thoughts contained in the New World Quarterly and the monthly Trinidad and Tobago Review journals, a writer and newspaper columnist, a university professor, a United Nations economic consultant, a social philosopher, and a true Caribbean patriot. The Caribbean is the workshop of the world. Lloyd Best, 3rd Annual Jagan Lecture, York University, March 3, 2001. Born in El Dorado to Carmen and MacDonald Best, Lloyd attended the Tagarigua Anglican School and Queen's Royal College in Port of Spain. At a time when few students were awarded island scholarships, Best won one to further his studies and pursued his tertiary level education at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, England. In 1957, Best joined the faculty of the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica as a research fellow. Best remained at the university, progressing academically until he attained the distinction of becoming a professor in economics. However, in 1976, he resigned to work full-time at the Tapia House movement, a political, social, and economic organization which grew out of his think tank of colleagues, the Tapia House Group.
They are often referred to as Tapiaites, but as original members of the Tapia House movement, select friends and colleagues of former parliamentarian Senator Lloyd Best reflect on his life's work and legacy. Independent thought and Caribbean freedom is not just the name of Lloyd's most famous essay. It was his ideal, his goal, his project, and if we could only want it enough to earn it, his legacy to us. The words are Nicholas Laughlin's. Indeed, Lloyd was recognized by CARICOM with an Order of the Caribbean Community. Comment.
Many people have commented on Lloyd as a radical thinker, a visionary. But I think if we wanted to encapsulate Lloyd's thought, I would mention two things. One, that he always insisted that the solutions to the problems of the Caribbean, and by extension the problems of Trinidad as a particular case of the Caribbean, had to be found by adopting a frame of reference and analysis rooted in the history, the sociology, and the psychology of the place. In other words, we could not look to received answers and wisdom from other places to describe who we are and to craft, and that is a word Lloyd would have enjoyed, to craft the solutions for ourselves. The second thing is, and this has always amazed and me about Lloyd, and I have admired that tremendously in him as a thinker, is that he had the capacity to dispense with what I might call encrustations of received orthodoxy and get straight to the heart and root of any issue. He didn't care who said what, right? If it didn't make sense to him in terms of the history of the place and the history of the people, then he dispensed with it. And that he had from the very beginning. And I think those two elements crystallized what he was saying in Independent Thought and Caribbean Freedom, which was the seminal essay that in effect began, in a way, the journey that brought all of us in. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that is very true. The thing about Independent Thought and Caribbean Freedom we have to see is that in the rubric of the essay, Lloyd linked independent thought to Caribbean freedom. He was in fact saying, to get Caribbean freedom, you have to have independent thought. You couldn't have one without the other. And that was, he thought, in my view correctly, that was very important in finding solutions in whatever we do. If we take, for example, the problem of the economy, independent thought by itself is an extremely important part of what was required to transform the economy from a colonial structure of production to a structure of production with an internal dynamic of its own. And the independent thought itself was manifested in the development of human capital as part of that process.
But I think the important thing for me is really to look back at where it originated, that philosophical expression of Lloyd. Because, and it's good to know that about Lloyd. Lloyd, remember, was at Cambridge and then Oxford. And he always told me when he was at Oxford doing his master's, George Padmore, one of the major elements of Caribbean, and not only that, of the whole colonial world, of expressing a desire for independence. He came to speak with them. And Lloyd said that when he heard George Padmore speak, he realized he had to come back home. That is why he went to the University of West Indies in 1957-58 period. And he said then he began to learn and understand the Caribbean and to recognize that the Caribbean is a special place. He sometimes used that, I could take a minute to explain, he used to use that by saying that the New World, which is what they developed, the group was called afterwards, that he became part of. He said the thing about the New World is that it comprised of 3 colonies. The colonies of settlement, which is United States, North America, Chile, Argentina, where the Europeans went, took their families and their money, and they settled there, drove back the indigenous populations and settled there. And then there were the colonies of conquest, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, where the Europeans set up a hegemony over them after conquest. And the third was the colonies of exploitation, and that's the Caribbean, where they removed largely the indigenous population and set up the plantations here based on European inputs, African inputs, and indentured labor from India. And therefore, doing that, he was able to recognize that this special entity called the Caribbean, this archipelago, required a different way of proceeding in terms of understanding our history and how to develop the kind of independent thought and Caribbean freedom.
He was a scientist most of all. And what any scientist does is to describe what he sees before him. And Lloyd was particularly careful. Naipaul, he said, was one of our first scientists, social scientists. He described what he saw, and many people were disturbed by what Naipaul described, but it's what he saw. And it is a very lonely world as it is for Naipaul, as you can see. And because this is a lonely world, people have avoided it. Lloyd always said that C.L.R. James was never a Marxist. But he covered whatever he was saying in the shroud of a Marxist so that he could have platforms open for him, for legitimacy. You see, if you're a Marxist and you end up in London, then there's a platform ready for you, of Trotskyites and Leninists and so on, that you can get on and so on. But if you're none of these things, then you have to build your own platform. for which you had to, nobody has no platform ready to make free. And he always said that one of the things that compromised Fidel Castro, who also isn't a Marxist or Leninist and so on, as few people are. The Chinese we are now discovering, never were. Now, the thing that handicapped Fidel, who is a true Caribbean man, is because he didn't have a framework, an ideological framework from which he can build on. So he was already in power, and there's no framework for which he could implement his plan and his program for Cuba. And what Lloyd had set out to do was really to provide that so that we who follow him will now have a context and a framework relating particularly to the Caribbean from which he can draw on. And that's what independence thought and Caribbean independent thought and freedom meant.
Entering conventional politics, the Tapia House movement contested the 1976 general election but was unsuccessful in gaining any seats. 10 years later, the political philosopher's dream of a party of parties was realized when some of Tapia's senior members helped form the National Alliance for Reconstruction. The NAR contested the 1986 general election and won in an unprecedented 33-3 landslide victory. But Bess was not amongst the victorious candidates, having taken the decision not to participate actively.
Does anyone know what influenced Lloyd's thinking, and is there a jumping off point at which he decided to legitimize his writings into becoming an active politician?
Lloyd had a genuine capacity to wear many hats and really do it discreetly. If he do intellectual work, he would bring the required objectivity, acknowledging that the observer will always color the outcome.
I think it is more than that. Mm-hmm. It is a new concept of what a politician is. Up to today, you hear people talking about, I have entered politics, and you talked about it as if it's a doorway you go through, right? I am a politician. I may not engage in electoral politics, but I have a point of view, a set of ideas which I make public with the view to persuading people to action. That is politics. What Lloyd was saying all along is that we couldn't do that, right? You couldn't persuade people to action until you had formulated a coherent and cohesive set of ideas about what we were, who we were, and how we go forward. So that was the initial work that had to be done. The formulation of those ideas, the argument about them, the discussion, the crystallization of the ideas, and then the mobilization of people on the basis of those ideas. But Lloyd would always acknowledge from the start that he was a politician, and it was no subtlety about it. It is the definition of what politics is where he made the difference. Right? And this thing about, and up to today you hear it, I took a decision to enter politics. What I really mean is to go into office. Right? To contest elections.
But the essential thing that Lloyd always said, he said, I've always been in politics. That's what Lloyd would say. And the important thing about it in the Tapia House group is that when we put together an issue related to constitutional reform, when they set up the constitutional exercise here, we made specific statements about that. We went to all the discussions that were taking place. And in fact, 4 of us were put into the House, into the Senate, at that time in 1974, because the issue of constitutional reform is before the country. That is Sir Lloyd Bess, Dennis Solomon, Hamlet Joseph Yaxi from Laventille, and myself. The 4 of us went there, and we went there to be able to raise issues that talked about where Trinidad and Tobago had to go, and always doing so in the context of a larger Caribbean whole. Never to say that we are dealing with just this southern part of the archipelago. We are talking about the whole, because that was an element always of independent thought and Caribbean freedom. So we put together a set of proposals regarding constitutional reform, and we debated that at all levels of the society.
Although Tapia independently never made it into the House of Representatives in the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Lloyd Bess served in the Senate twice. From 1974 to 1976, he was one of 4 opposition senators, the others being Ivan Lachlan, Hamlet Joseph, and Dennis Solomon, who was specifically brought into the Senate by former parliamentarian Selwyn Richardson to lead debates on constitutional reform. In 1981, Lloyd Bess returned to the Senate again, this time serving as leader of the opposition for the United Labour Front until 1983. Over the years, Bess continued to lecture as a visiting professor at the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. He was also a guest fellow and a guest scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Smithsonian Institute in the US. He also worked in Africa, India, and Europe, and for the United Nations as a consultant. In recent times, he worked with Caribbean novelist George Lemming, his friend and colleague for 40 years, to produce an anthology on Caribbean civilization.
Can you take us through Lloyd's breakthrough seminal work with Professor Carrie Levitt, which would have been influenced by a series of essays before the publishing of Models of the Pure Plantation Economy?
Lloyd's plantation economy model was an attempt to fashion a theory of Caribbean economy to make sense of Caribbean reality. He felt he needed to do this because he felt all the prescriptions done so far for the Caribbean didn't make any sense. And these prescriptions were not leading to any result. For example, he had very great apprehension with the policy of industrialization by invitation, which is how he called it, that Caribbean governments embarked upon towards the end of the 1950s, Williams, Puerto Rico, and so on. And he brought Arthur Lewis here and Theodora Moscoso from Puerto Rico to develop a program. The evaluation of that program didn't prove that it was not possible to build an internal dynamic in the economy, which is to say, to allow the structure of production to develop its own linkages and allow output to take place from inside the economy itself. And it really was a policy that invited foreign capital, foreign management, foreign know-how, add to that foreign markets, and use domestic human capital in the form of labor and whatever skills they brought in. It didn't really deliver. And the plantation economy model came out of a historical analysis of Caribbean economy, dedicated to identifying how the economy really functioned and why it continued to function the same way from the days of slavery throughout indentureship, right down to active government after we got independence. And that was really the idea behind devising a model of how the Caribbean economy functioned. And that led to what many say was a seminal contribution to economic thought at the time. Since then, we can evaluate and see where we have gone. In my view, it is not so much that we have remained an economy that focuses essentially on the export sector or the export of staples, particularly oil and sugar and bananas, tourism if it's Barbados, etc., or bauxite and tourism in Jamaica. But we have also, in that process, developed somewhat, I would say, to a reasonable extent, the residential sector in terms of domestic, if we define that to mean domestic, physical and human capital development. The problem, however, if we take one single example, we combine it in the elements of steel band, calypso, carnival, we have treated these things as Cinderella things that we talk about, and we really have not shown that we believe in these things by putting real capital investment in them to transform them, to give them part of the internal dynamic that we seek to get.
But I wanted to just come back, for me always it is coming back to the linkages between the economic theory and the action in the realm of politics, right? What Lloyd would always call the nexus of thought and action, because this is where the role of governments became critical to in effect guide on the basis of such thinking and ideas, this coherent theory of ideas. Government becomes critical to not only, first of all, politically educate the population, trusting in them, but also to guide resources in the way that would facilitate the people developing these things. Mickey made an interesting thing there just now about it takes a lot of energy to move from one level of orbit to another. Once you're in that orbit, you can spin. And where is that energy going to come from? That energy is not about finance. That energy is not about oil and gas. That energy is the commitment of the vast majority of the citizens of the country understanding and believing in the way forward. That is where the energy is going. Until that is got done, it's not going to happen.
And that raises the issue of governance in a very important sense, in two important senses. One is to get people's participation. We really need to reform the representative system to make the parliament as the legislative body better able to convey the aspirations and the hopes and the feelings of the people, so that we can make the decisions in relation to what direction the economy needs to go. And that has been the big problem. The second thing is that we need to empower citizens at the level of the community.
Testimony to his indefatigable work ethic, 2 weeks before his death and in failing health, Bess was with his professor colleague Eric Sincere completing his newest publication titled Economic Policy and Management Choices, a contemporary economic history of Trinidad and Tobago, 1950 to 1952. On February 25, 2010, the University of the West Indies St. Augustine launched Essays on the Theory of the Plantation Economy, a historical and institutional approach, a new book by Lloyd Bess and Professor Carrie Levitt, revisiting their 1960 seminal work, Models of the Pure Plantation Economy, and highlighting the present-day significance of their landmark theory. In delivering the feature address, Brian Kahn, research officer at the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, observed, "The major contribution to Caribbean thought are attributed to works which have blurred the lines between different disciplines. A significant opportunity arises when a literary work is able to transcend these lines and contribute to the development of not only its primary discipline, but to a uniquely relevant Caribbean ideology."
What society do you believe Lloyd would ultimately want to see for Trinidad and Tobago? And do we now have to proceed to constitutional reform?
And now I think we have to be wary about simply changing willy-nilly the text of the Constitution. Although I think there is much need for a parliament, we still don't have it. There's much need for a parliament that represents people. Lloyd before he go, always said that, that the present arrangement represent the leaders, the maximum leaders. And none of these so-called members of parliament speak for constituency. And that I think we have to change that. But I don't think we are required to make any change of the text of the Constitution.
I don't know if we have to change the text of the Constitution. I think one of the things people get hung up on with Constitution reform and with government, I think really what we have been looking for all along is to craft a system of governance. And people use the term, but they don't understand what it means, because they're really talking about good government. But government in itself is about men and individuals who occupy office. Governance is about understanding arrangements and agreements among the people in terms of the relationship between themselves and their government and in terms of the relationships among themselves. It answers the fundamental philosophical question that any society has to answer. How shall we live? Right? That is what governance is about. A constitution is an important part of that governance framework, but it is not all. And that is why the cultural issues that Lloyd addressed, how we live with ourselves, how we respect each other, which you cannot define in a constitution, is so important to our emancipation as a people and as a society.
Well, first thing I want to say is that with regard to constitutional reform, that was a Tapia exercise. It never must be given the impression that it was Lloyd. It was Lloyd together with all of us.
Very important.
I think I want to stress that point, because that we must recognize that by the time we reached Tapia and the issue of constitutional reform, there was a whole range of things for years before that we were arguing with each other and so on. And it's important to know that Lloyd himself was encouraged and his views shifted as a result of the intercourse that took place. Now, I think that's a very important factor, a very important feature for the process of Tapia, the Tapia group and then the Tapia movement. The other thing too is to always attempt to make an interpretation of what the country is saying. And Michael made reference to that. In 1986, the country said we want a unified approach. It said that again in this election. That's what it said. And what it said, what it expects, that the leadership would have the sense of the place, the vibrations of the place, to fashion instruments that could make that possible.
Married twice, first from 1958 to 2006 to Christiane, with whom he had 4 children, Robert, Shorjak, Stuart, Kamla, and secondly to Sunita Maharaj, with whom he had 2 more daughters, Carmel and It Carmel. Lloyd Best passed away on March 19, 2007, after suffering from prostate cancer and diabetes. I know that everyone in the world has to die, but I do not see why it should apply to me. Death is only statistical. I grant you that the statistics are high, but they are, after all, only numbers. Mila Cosa Riggio, writer recalling the words of Best. Lloyd Best was certainly amongst the great Caribbean intellectuals and activists of our time. He was there amongst a short and exclusive list containing the likes of C.L.R. James, Rex Nettleford, Amy Cesar, Jose Marti, Franz Fanon, and just a few others who've done their life's work fashioning the foundation for Caribbean civilization. Tony Fraser, journalist.
It was Lloyd who coined the phrase party of parties. In a world where coalition governments are emerging with frequency, and in the context of Trinidad and Tobago where we are flirting once more with this governing philosophy, has Lloyd's dream arrived?
When Lloyd advocated back in the mid-80s the formation of a party of parties, it came out of still searching for new ways and means to overcome and defeat what Lloyd Taylor had earlier talked about, the conventional politics. In this case, 2 critical aspects. 1, maximum leadership, and 2, the ethnic basis of our political mobilization, right? In fact, prior to the enunciation of the Party of Parties idea, remember that Tapia House movement had participated in the elections of '76, were beaten in the context of having perhaps the best set of ideas and candidates. And Lloyd tried to evaluate, understanding, and that's where the whole issue of the 9 tribes and the tribal basis of mobilization and ethnic affiliation came out. So the Party of Parties was an attempt to rise above that, to acknowledge that it existed, but to rise above it and hence defeat it. 1, if you have several parties, you can't have a maximum leader because the other party political leaders are strong enough to corral that person. And secondly, in terms of the ethnic thing, if all the ethnicities are represented, then certain securities are given. Now, somebody told me that the coalition, the People's Partnership, is the realization of Lloyd's dream of a party of parties. I don't think so, for many reasons which we can't go into here. But one of the things I do want to say is that Lloyd always took the long view. And I believe he understood history, he understood that culture changes slowly, but you had to look for those developments in the society that led in the right direction, right? So I think that he would be pleased with what is happening in our society now for several reasons. And just to mention that before he died, he said that, he would continue his interest and in looking on at what happens in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean, wherever he might be.
His monthly publication, the acclaimed The Trinidad and Tobago Review, is still in publication, and the Lloyd Best Institute of the West Indies continues to hold promises for finer minds. In the words of Dr. Norman Jovan of the University of the West Indies, throughout his life, Lloyd has been a great conceptualizer, a source of inspiration and of a constant flow of new ideas and of ways of seeing the world and the Caribbean reality that profoundly influenced the thinking of several generations of scholars and political activists. Above all, Lloyd has been an exemplar of the practice of critical, independent thought. In this sense, his contribution is timeless, and the entire Caribbean nation will forever be in his debt. It was this brilliance that former parliamentarian and Senator Lloyd Best brought to the Parliament, forever influencing the politics of Trinidad and Tobago. Lexicon of Lloydisms, phrases created by Professor Lloyd Best, which became a part of our political and economic dictionary. The maximum leader. Doctor politics. A party of parties. A tribe of tribes. A big Mako Senate. The algebra of politics. The validating elite. The parasitic oligarchy. Industrialization by invitation. Screwdriver industries. Professor Lloyd Best, a Caribbean intellectual.